I'm Sam Sill. I'm the Public Affairs Director for the Missoula Organization of Realtors. Thank you so much for being here today for this presentation of Making Missoula Home, a Path to Attainable Housing. It's great to see such a fantastic turnout of so many of our community members and indeed community leaders here today for this conversation about how we can improve housing affordability in Missoula. Because we have a really great quality of life here in Missoula, Montana. We have a great place, and I think that it's safe to say, given the choice, most people want to be here. Unfortunately, home prices and rents are increasing much more rapidly than many of us can afford, and it's evident that too few of us have housing options and home ownership opportunities that meet their needs. The Missoula Organization of Realtors is an advocate for consumers of housing. We want every Missoulian to have access to home ownership and to housing that they can afford. That's why a little more than a year ago, MOR began planning Making Missoula Home. We wanted to gain a better understanding of the reasons behind rapidly increasing housing costs and to come up with some potential solutions that the local governments, the private sector, our many nonprofits, and the community as a whole can explore and implement together. With that in mind, we formed a diverse group of partners for this project, including the City of Missoula, Missoula County, the Missoula Area Chamber of Commerce, the Missoula Building Industry Association, and the Missoula Economic Partnership. Each of these organizations and their constituents have a stake in improving housing affordability, and each contributed significantly to Making Missoula Home. In addition to building partnerships, we wanted the analysis of Making Missoula Home to use a collaborative process that fully leveraged stakeholder resources and expertise. To that end, we retained Werwith Consultants as a consultant for this study. Daniel Werwith and his team are experienced with housing development and housing affordability issues. They have undertaken these kinds of analyses before, and Daniel and his team were the lead authors, researchers, and facilitators of this process. We then formed a diverse group of advisory stakeholders with experience in housing and development to oversee the project and to ensure that our work was grounded in local realities. This group includes local government representatives, Aaron Pahan of the Office of Housing and Community Development, as well as Patrick O'Haron from the County Community and Planning Services Office. In addition to the public sector folks, the advisory group was made up of builders, developers, realtors, land use consultants and engineers, lenders, and members of the business community. We wanted to try to bring together everyone with a stake in housing. We thank them for all the time and energy and passion they poured into this project, and we know that it inevitably enriched the final product. In addition to our partner organizations and advisory group, there are a few others we would be seriously remiss in not recognizing. Missoula Mayor John Engen and our county commissioners Gene Curtis, Cola Rowley, and Dave Strohmeyer were instrumental in this project, not only for their support of Making Missoula Home, but for their willingness to engage with us and provide their insights throughout the process. I'd also like to thank Missoula City Council members Gwen Jones and John DeBari for providing us with their insights, and we certainly look forward to more conversations with our local government folks as we move into the implementation stage. And last but certainly not least, we'd like to thank some of our affordable housing providers, namely the Missoula Housing Authority, Homeward, and NeighborWorks Montana for providing their insights as providers of affordable housing. And as you might imagine, a comprehensive analysis of the housing market and recommendations costs money. And without the support of our financial sponsors, it is clear to me that we could have, this project could have never happened. So thank you very much to our sponsors. The report, including an executive summary, is available online at MissoulaRealEstate.com/Making Missoula Home. This presentation is being recorded by Missoula Community Access Television and will be made available on MCAT and online in February. In a moment, we'll turn it over to Daniel Warwith to present Making Missoula Home and its findings. But first, we want to give you an opportunity to hear from representatives from our partners. Here with us today is Jean Curtis. She is a county commissioner, and she's also representing the Missoula Economic Partnership today, as she is a member of their board of directors. Aaron Pahan with the Office of Housing and Community Development. John Horner is here representing the Missoula Area Chamber of Commerce. He is the chair of their board of directors. And Ryan Fry is here representing the Missoula Building Industry Association. He is also the chair of their board of directors. So please join me in welcoming the partners today. I think we'll let Jean go first.
Good morning. I'm pleased to be here this morning to represent the Missoula Economic Partnership Board and Missoula County. We all recognize that attainable housing is important to families in Missoula County, but it's also important to economic development. Missoula Economic Partnership has focused the efforts in Missoula County on creating good-paying jobs. But as we work with local expanding businesses or new businesses looking to relocate here, we always hear about the need for a strong workforce and housing for that workforce. They're a factor every time. So we have a lot of good reasons why people want to live here. It's beautiful, we have great people, we have access to public lands, there's a university, we do have a strong workforce, there's arts and culture, and a great public school system. The employees need places to live, and they want a choice of housing types. And that's why Missoula Economic Partnership invested in this study, and we look forward to finding the partnership's role in a community solution. Missoula County invested in this study because we know that many families struggle to find attainable housing in both the rental and home ownership markets in all the communities in Missoula County. We also know there are thousands of approved lots that have not been developed. Most of them went through the subdivision process before the recession. I remember when we used to see 3 subdivisions a week. So we were curious to know, why are they still just sitting? Is it because the land prices were too high when they started the development and they just don't pencil out? Is it because there's not enough infrastructure? Is it because the lots are the wrong size for the current market? Or do we just need a developer to grab this bull by the horns and take off? The timing of this report fits well into the county's current work on our land use strategy and updating our zoning. Our population continues to grow, so we will need even more housing. We will all have to challenge our own assumptions as to our own roles in finding a community solution. It will take collaboration and partnerships. We will have to find a balance between what are often viewed as conflicting community values. I would also challenge you that as you listen to Daniel give the report today, to think, what is your role? What do you know that maybe we haven't thought about? What connection do you have? What dots do you see that need to be connected? Because it's going to take all of us to do this. It really does take a village. Thanks. Aaron's next.
Thank you guys for coming. It's clear that Missoulians care about a lot of things, and housing is one of those, and we're glad that you guys are here and engaged in the issue. Housing prices in Missoula have steadily risen in the last few years. It's becoming increasingly difficult to find some place to rent that fits your budget and meets your needs. We accept these statements as truth because Missoulians are sharing these experiences with us every day. What we haven't quite understood is why. Why are home prices rising so steeply in comparison to the rest of the nation? Why, despite consistent construction of multifamily units, does our vacancy rate continue to hover around 2%? The answers to these questions and many other questions that are addressed through Making Missoula Home are complex. It's not simply about land availability, regulations, or a lack of supply. It has more to do with the convergence of all these barriers at one place in time. Making Missoula Home provides valuable insight into how local governments, developers, nonprofits, The private sector and the broader community can work together to overcome these barriers. The report will serve as a helpful tool as the City of Missoula works to create comprehensive housing policy that will allow every Missoulian to have affordability and choice in their housing options. The best thing is we don't need to reinvent the wheel when we address housing policy. Many recommendations that came out of this study are already being used across the Rocky Mountain West to address housing supply and housing affordability. These communities are seeing real and dramatic impacts from strategic investment, increased partnership and collaboration, which I think you'll hear a lot about today, and alignment of our regulations with our goals as a community. We're learning a great deal from these peer communities that we can bring to our process. So we would like to thank everyone that has committed their time and energy and expertise to this project, especially our partners, Missoula County and the Missoula Organization of Realtors. We spent a lot of time talking about definitions and methodology, things that aren't always fun, but everybody was at the table sharing their opinions and working through those conversations together. We hope everyone that's been involved in this project will stay at the table as we work as a community to solve this problem together. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Ryan Fry. I'm a builder here in Missoula and the current president of the Missoula Building Industry Association. Our organization consists of builders, subcontractors, suppliers, and associates affiliated with the building industry. So on behalf of all our members, I would like to thank everyone here, especially the event organizers, for the opportunity to bring the builder's perspective to attainable housing. We as builders truly want to be a part of the movement toward creating attainable housing in our city and county. So rather than bring up a bunch of points that are going to probably be talked about from the report today, I figured I would share kind of my personal story in the attainable housing industry here in Missoula as a builder. In December 2015, I purchased a lot with a partner. The property contained a house and 7,000 square feet of land zoned RM 145. So perfect zoning for an infill project we had in mind. Long story short, and a lot of learning on our end, we were able to get city approval for 3 units on the lot, 2 single family, 1 duplex, and we retained the existing house. Permits were issued in November of 2016. We broke ground in April 2017 after the winter, finished our first single family in September, and our second in November. Both these homes were priced at $199,000. So now keep in mind, these are not palatial mansions. 850 square feet, 2-bed, 1.5 baths. A good starter home. Both sold immediately after being put on the market. Great, right? Attainable housing for families with 1 child and people just starting out. So let's fast forward to 2018. We found another lot to repeat the process on similar zoning, so we can still do the same thing. But already in 2 years, that same kind of lot has risen $70,000. So spread that out over 4 units, and land costs have increased per unit $17,500 in 2 years. Add to that the rise in labor costs and the fact that softwoods have risen 30% in the last year. You can see where the price is going. These are a portion of the issues we face as builders, and I want to build attainable housing. I want my employees who are making middle income salaries to be able to afford attainable housing. And I believe there are ways to make this happen despite the challenges, but it's going to take some hard decisions from all the parties involved. So again, we are happy to be a part of the discussion, and I hope that example kind of just showed you what we're facing as builders is just external costs that we have no control over. And so on that note, thank you very much, and we hope we can move forward.
So good morning, everyone. My name is John Horner. I'm Vice President of Commercial Lending at First Interstate Bank, but I'm here representing the Chamber of Commerce as the Board of Directors President. The Chamber of Commerce is extremely proud to be involved in this and want to thank Sam and MOR for taking the lead on this. It's a big project, and we all know, and one of the reasons you're here is the importance that this is carrying for Missoula and where it's going to go in the future. This project, at the Chamber, one of the things that's extremely important to us is collaboration. And the only way that this project happened is because of collaboration among various entities, different organizations, governmental organizations, not-for-profits, and for-profits. We have to continue to work together in order to move these things forward. This is a great example of what can be produced with that type of collaboration. So I'm here to encourage the continued collaboration of all those organizations to keep Missoula moving forward. It truly is the only way this project is going to happen. So without it and without your continued interest, we may as well buckle this up and put it on a shelf. So stay engaged, stay involved, continue to input what your thoughts are and where you think things will be going, because what Missoula looks like in 10, 15, 20, 25 years is up to the people in this room. So challenge you, stay engaged. We at the Chamber will be, and we'll encourage you to come in and give us your input, give your input to the MOR, or anyone you think has any influence to continue to work on this. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for your engagement. And now I think we're going to give it up to Dan, right? Perfect. Thank you all.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Daniel Werwath. I'm a principal with Werwath Associates. We're a community development consulting firm that's been working in affordable housing for over 20 years, and we're excited to be here today. Excited to see this room. This is, I think, the biggest room of people I've ever talked to about affordable housing. Kind of signals the level of engagement and interest in the community. And that's something that I heard throughout the process over the last 9 months of connecting with really diverse stakeholders as part of both the qualitative and quantitative process that we did. So we have a lot of stuff to cover. This has ended up being about a 150-page report. So I want to make sure that we cover the high points of that report today. So I'm just going to dive right in. So our firm, it's multi-generational. My dad started doing affordable housing work in the Mountain West back in the late 80s, and I followed in his footsteps. We've done a lot of work in Mountain West communities, particularly smaller, high desirability communities like Missoula that really create a unique set of conditions that drive housing affordability issues, which I think everyone realizes is an issue right now here. We work in both planning, program development with nonprofits, and actual nonprofit affordable housing development. So we bring a really diverse set of perspectives rather than being kind of siloed. We're always working in a variety of different capacities, and so that's the perspective we come to with the report, is that, you know, it's not just about the programmatic ideas, it's about implementation, and it all has to be backed up by local policy and public investment. The process of the report really does look at both statistics, and we interviewed, I think, more people than I ever have for a project like this, over 30 interviews of really diverse stakeholders in the community. The report is structured to cover some major sectors. We look at housing and demographic information, we look at housing market data, we analyze affordability, we analyze the development context, and then we did a really interesting consumer survey that gave us some really interesting insights about how housing is perceived in the community. And then we provide a set of comprehensive recommendations that are sort of a laundry list of the various types of tools and approaches that you as a community could implement to help address these issues. So one of the big issues is that we want to do at the beginning is talk about affordability and attainability as different things. I think affordable housing has sometimes stigmas, And when we talk about housing affordability in this report, we're really talking about all income levels. We're talking about people paying less than a third of their gross income for housing. And that affects people at all different levels. Housing affordability is something that affects people who own houses, people trying to buy houses, but attainability really affects people's ability to achieve housing. So buy a house, find that rental housing that they don't have right now, and that was really the focus of it. The issues that are facing the community right now are very much a factor of a bunch of different issues, but the big one, if you think about it, housing in a hermetically sealed community, housing is a function of the wages that that community produces. When you start to have external factors, wages from outside, retirees with money from selling a house somewhere else, you start to see this divergence between housing cost and wages. And that's really what's happening in this moment. And there's a lot of different factors driving that, but that's something we get to in the report. When we do this type of analysis, we really look at the spectrum of housing needs. We certainly focused on homeownership. That was really a big focus for the Realtors. But they were really on board with our suggestion that you kind of have to look at the whole spectrum of housing. If you're paying too much for your rental, you're never going to save a down payment and get into an affordable home. If you can't buy it, when someone buys an affordable home, they free up a rental unit, right? This stuff is all interconnected, from homeless services through foreclosure prevention services and home repair services. So you kind of got to think of the whole spectrum to really impact it in a system change way. As we've heard a lot, diverse strategies and collaborations are going to be the key here. There's no one silver bullet for affordable housing in the Mountain West. And it really does take trying a bunch of different strategies with a bunch of different directions, and really creating a framework for measuring what your goals are, what your impacts on those goals are, and how you are impacting them, and have an iterative process of looking at your strategies and constantly updating them. And hopefully this report provides a baseline for thinking about these issues, thinking about how going forward, goal setting, testing of different approaches, and real data-driven measurement of how that's impacting housing affordability and the needs in the community. So in this report, we defined the problem, the factors driving it. We looked at the demand factors in the community, things like population growth, job growth, kind of setting the stage. And then we do housing affordability analysis that looks at the gap between wages and housing costs. I think a lot of times, especially in the public sector, we get caught on purchase price or rental rate. But really, housing affordability is about a gap between wages and housing costs, and really thinking about ongoing measurement, looking at both of those issues. We really define what housing attainability means for different income levels in the community. So we actually know these are the prices, these are the rental rates that we need to target. And we talk to and engage with a bunch of different stakeholders to get them engaged around this, because again, solutions are going to take a little bit of investment from a lot of people, from individual community members through partner organizations and stakeholders. So the recommendations in this report really do focus on a diverse set of implementation stakeholders. So really thinking about how both the public and private sector can collaborate on implementing these things. So everybody knows there's a housing affordability problem. No one that I talked to in the course of this report was like, "Yeah, no, you're fine." When we get to the sections on the actual consumer survey data, you'll see it's quite dramatic. The perceptions of housing affordability issues right now. But what we're looking at is the gap of wages and housing costs, and so to do that, we looked at demographic and housing data, including market statistics around sales and rental conditions. Then we looked at incomes and economic trends, and actual availability of housing to try and get a picture of, to quantify what everyone sort of senses intuitively is going on. So key demographics, your population grew really healthily in the last half decade, almost 6%. The county grew slower, so a lot of that growth is focused in the urban area or the urbanized area. And you've added a lot of people in the workforce. The interesting thing is that despite all this growth, when we look at the number of housing units, they grew roughly in proportion with the size of the population, which typically means that you shouldn't be seeing the type of cost escalations that we are seeing in the market. One of the issues that's driving this is that you have a lot of smaller households. In that same period, we've seen a shift towards smaller household groups and probably smaller families and individuals, students, seniors living alone, things like that, that create a lot of pressure, even though the number of units and households are relatively in balance. 47% of the population in the city is considered low income by HUD standards. So that's people earning below 80% of the median income. And that's a big portion of folks. And it's that group of people that really is increasingly priced out of home ownership. And a lot of these folks also are even up to that level having issues finding rental housing that's affordable. The family median income, which is a measure of the family unit, is pretty healthy for a community this size at just around $67,000, and that's about the same for the county as well. But there are still countywide 17,000 households that are paying more than a third of their income for housing. And that's really the measure that we use in the industry. It's the measure that the census uses to understand housing affordability. And so that's that cost burden figure, and we'll touch on that a couple times through this report when we look at it. The really dramatic one of the dramatic numbers is that 41% of city households are paying more than 30% of their income for housing, more than they should. And 69% of them are renters earning less than $35,000 a year. So this is something that's really impacting the lower income folks, and this is very normal. As housing costs go up, the people who can pay more, that trickles down and impacts the lowest income folks the most. And I think we're starting to see that, and that's something that you don't hear a lot about in public processes, at land use hearing meetings, but it shows up in the statistic. One of the really interesting things we uncovered with the report is that we estimate that there is at least 6,000 prospective home buyers, current renters who make enough money and should be able to afford to buy a house in the community who currently can't because there aren't enough houses priced at that income level. So really think about that. That's a really big number, and it really speaks to the need to develop more affordable housing options going forward. So we looked at housing market, and the housing market, I think, of course, the realtors here do a really great job of producing annual reports, and they're very transparent with their data, which isn't always the case. You guys are really lucky in that sense. But you're seeing a strong market recovery from the economic downturn in the mid-2000s. The median sales price at the end of 2017 is just shy of $270,000. That's the equivalent of needing about a $70,000 a year income to be able to buy that house. There's was a 10-year record for building permits countywide, and you exceeded peak home sales volume from the really big rush of the 2000s. So that was just over 1,500 sales in the last year. So that's a lot of real estate activity that's happening. You can see here the kind of, I guess that's a mustardy color there. That's the housing that most working class folks need to be priced at. And it's shrinking. And you can see really proportionally how the size of the higher end home market is growing. And it's driven by a lot of factors. You hear from the building community and the work that I know from housing development, everything they say is true. All the costs are just going up all the time. And it's really reflected in sales prices. And it's also being driven by consumers with more money, a lot of them that aren't necessarily earning wages in the community. And that's really where a lot of this divergence comes from. But when we look at these statistics, the homes under $200,000 dropped from 41% of the market to 25% of the market in just 2 years. So this is a really rapid shrinking of the affordable housing segment. And that's even considering a pretty big expansion of the condo and townhome segment as a more affordable type of housing when compared to detached housing. Detached homes below 200,000 have decreased 50% since 2014. They've shrunk in half. And that is really where a lot of the tightness in the market is seen as we look at this. Only 90 single-family homes were sold below $200,000 in 2017, compared to thinking about maybe a demand number in the 6,000 range. So then we also look at listing data, and we took sort of a snapshot in April when we started this project as a way of kind of gauging the market, and that's generally a good time as a lot of housing starts to come online for the summer sales season. We found only 9 detached listings under $200,000. There were 22 total between $200,000 and $250,000 countywide. Detached homes below $200,000 represented 2% of the listings in the MLS system at that time, and less than 1% of the listings in the city. All homes, so this is detached homes, condos, townhomes, are only 11% of listings, and then 2 to 250 was another 11%. So you've got basically 22% of the market listings needing to serve well over half the population of potential buyers. So that's a tight market. It really is something that intuition, the data supports the intuition. Rental housing is another really big concern, and it's a harder one to quantify because unlike for sale housing, we don't have the really great MLS system for tracking data. But there are a lot of challenges in the rental market, and anecdotally, friends of mine here in town relate that to me all the time. But there's sort of a perfect storm of factors all contributing to this. You've got an increasing number of people that can't afford ownership who are stuck renting, right? And that's one of the big constrictions at the top, higher wage earning renters who can't purchase housing. You've got robust population growth and younger demographics and students who typically absorb a lot of rental stock in their smaller households. And that small household number is really the trick. And what we see a lot of times is particularly when you have a lot of lower income, smaller households, things like students that can band together and rent a 3 or 4 bedroom house, they quickly outpace the buying power of a 1 income family or a 2 income family with a 3 or 4 income household that shares an existing home. And we saw that in the statistics, particularly challenges for larger housing, rental housing serving 3 and 4 bedroom family needs. So rental housing vacancy rates are your biggest indicator. These are taken from multifamily projects and some single family rentals, but mostly from larger projects. You've consistently been below 5% rental vacancy rates for years. This is the threshold at which you are really in a tight market and can expect to see escalating rents. You really need to work proactively to add multifamily housing and other distributed rental housing to the market. And as Aaron alluded to, you've got a great pipeline of adding housing, but it just hasn't quite got ahead of the demand curve at this point. Many of your market rents are exceeding fair market rents, which limits the ability of using things like Section 8 vouchers and other things that are designed to assist people in existing housing. And that's another incredibly challenging situation that arises out of high rents, is when you can't even use the federal tools on those houses because they're too expensive to meet the guidelines. So this is really the best way to understand this is that vacancy rate around below 3% is a functional zero vacancy rate. It means that there's a few units being painted or turned over, but for the most part, there's almost no availability. So the impacts of this are really important, and I alluded to this a little bit before talking about housing spectrums and how these things interact. But folks that are paying a lot in rent, they have less disposable income. They're unable to save for home ownership. It can drive up consumer debt, which hurts mortgage capacity. And you know, again, higher income households being in rental housing mean they're going to be able to pay more for it, and that's going to price out the lowest income folks. And I think from the business community, the biggest concern is that when new people come here to join the workforce for a job, when you're recruiting new workforce, they're almost always going to rent first. And if they come into a community and experience a really hard time finding a rental, it starts to block your pipeline of workforce right at the first step. And that's a really challenging situation long-term for economic growth. So we looked at really digging down and defining what affordability is for the community. And that's something that in all the city and county policies, they had never drilled down to that level to actually say, this is how we're going to define affordability. And we think that's one of the most important platforms for developing a robust community response to affordable housing needs. So what you see here is a sort of complex matrix, which is how the federal government defines incomes and housing affordability. We look at something called area median income, which has different levels of income depicted here vertically, and then different household sizes, right? So those are the income levels at which basically we use to standardize and gauge the different types of housing responses. Things like folks below that lowest level at 50% of AMI, we're really looking at doing subsidized rental housing, things like Section 8 vouchers, because that's really their affordability. When we get up to that 65% level, we're looking at things like home ownership strategies and how we can really create a robust set of responses across all the income levels. We use this matrix to then look at what people can afford. So here we've just taken that annual income number, we've divided it by 12 to create a monthly gross income, and then looked at a third of that. And so this is really what we look at as a measure of what affordable rents for a family should be, based on the different income levels and family sizes. And obviously family sizes correspond to house sizes a little bit, right? We usually assume one person per bedroom for the type of analysis that we did. So when we looked at these numbers, what we found, and what you'll see here as we go across the different housing types, and this is data that's a combination of some proprietary market data that was provided by an affordable housing developer here in town, and then the survey from the Western Montana chapter of property managers. And so what we see here is the average rents for different size homes and the income level that you would need to achieve that. And so in this case, what we're seeing is that you know, for folks under about 60 or 70% of median income, there's serious affordability challenges in the existing rental market. The bigger data set that we had from the property managers is a little more challenging because it isn't as transparent as we'd like. And it's a blend of, I think, subsidized and non-subsidized properties, so the numbers aren't as accurate as they are of the total market. The bottom line there shows us what a very recent market comparative study did in Missoula, and there we see that the average rents really are around 70% of median income in terms of affordability. Those are folks that really should be considering home ownership, and they're barely affording their rental housing, which is a really, really unsustainable situation in terms of that housing spectrum idea that people can move through that spectrum with fluidity. In the report, we break down the populations by city and county of renter households and look at their different income levels and look at the different strategies we think about serving those folks. This is where we come to that number of you know, nearly 6,000 people that could buy a home if there was affordable housing options out there. And that's really those bottom three tiers of folks you can look at. And what you see in that column are the number of households that we're talking about in each of these income ranges. Those are renter households. The left column is the city, the right column is the county. So we're really talking about a really big group of people that could be moving into home ownership that aren't. And then you're also looking at a really big group of people there under $35,000 a year that really need some robust assistance in getting economically stabilized with affordable housing, affordable rental housing. So we looked also at home ownership affordability, and this is a very similar type of thing. The shaded areas there show you the gap between housing price and what people can afford. So, for instance, a one-person household buying a basic, 1 or 2 bedroom house has at 65% of the area median income. That's about what we would consider someone who should be able to buy a home in most communities. Has almost a $60,000 gap between the market costs and what's actually available in the market, and understanding that that's from last year's data, right? These numbers aren't going down, and in many cases, I think we're going to see pretty rapid price escalation going forward in homeownership. So what we saw here is that there's some gaps all the way up to the median income level. So people earning 100% of the median income need some help buying a house in this community, depending on their family size. And hopefully this methodology is something that can be recreated annually to look at housing affordability and where things are at as a way of understanding this. Those gaps there were for detached homes. We also looked at townhomes and condos, and you can see here that there are smaller gaps, but the gaps still exist. And again, the inventory, especially on townhomes, is relatively small. So even though there is some price availability there, the number of units that are actually being put out into the community are very small. Condos, likewise, actually in some cases are a little less affordable than townhomes because of the extra fees that they carry. And there's also a lot of difficulty sometimes getting those financed with conventional mortgage financing. And so that's always something to keep in mind when you look at those affordability issues. So again, we're seeing affordability gaps up to 80% of median income in all housing types. And so it really suggests a need for a very proactive response around trying to fight against that. And I think one of the takeaways of these numbers, though, is that you guys aren't so far gone that you can't do, a robust response and get this under control. I think that's one of the key things to note, that you're on the cusp of a bad situation, but it hasn't totally gone over the waterfall yet. To understand the consumer side of things, which is really helpful, right? It's the more subjective type of data that we need to look at. We did a consumer survey that was provided both online and in paper format. We got over 900 responses. Some of the big highlights of this data is that 90+% of existing owners feel like their housing is meeting their needs. But only 58% of renters do. And the big issue with renters is, again, size. Particularly families, are having trouble finding housing that's big enough to meet their family's needs. And that's one of the big challenges we see in a lot of communities, but something that definitely keep in mind as responses are developed. 50% of folks said that said their house didn't meet their needs. They said it was because of size. So that's really highlights a need for 3 and 4 bedroom affordable rental options. 80% of the renters in the survey said they desired to own a home. We didn't use that number in calculating the demand numbers. We used just a standard 1/3, which has been used as a pretty standard number when gauging demand in rental populations. But this shows that there are a lot of people really interested in this. Only 26% of those people had tried to purchase a home before. So it shows us that there's a big gap between the knowledge of what it takes to buy a home, and this suggests a really big need for supporting things like homebuyer education and training and things like down payment assistance that help lower those barriers. But the biggest, everyone saw a lot of obstacles to purchase who hadn't purchased a home. The biggest one was the price of homes. 72% said that was what was holding them back from buying a home. But it's really interesting to note, there's 31,000 renter households that earn more than $35,000 a year in this community, and that's a lot of potential buyers. So even if you take 1/3 of that number, right, or less, you have a really robust potential buyer population. So we asked about housing type. That's a big issue that came up throughout the report, and it's a big thing with inward growth and more dense development and reliance on maybe more attached housing styles. One of the things we heard from consumers is there's just a very strong preference for detached housing. Folks said that they would rather live in a detached house out in the county, far from services, than they would even a townhome or a condo located in the urban core of the city. And I think that's something that needs to be looked at in terms of thinking about how you provide a variety of housing options for people, and make sure that consumer demands are being met, and things like goals of inward growth, which are really important, don't create unintended consequences of pushing people into the rural areas and becoming self-defeating. There's a widely perceived housing affordability problem. 93% of respondents that lived in the city say that it's expensive or very expensive in the city, whereas only 59% said that in the county. It was interesting when we pulled those out, though. City residents think the county's affordable, but county residents don't think the county's affordable. So that's and local government response. There's clearly a lot of folks who don't feel like the local governments are doing enough to address these issues. You know, the slight majority of people don't think that the city's doing anything at all to meet affordable housing needs, which is certainly not true, knowing the work that Erin and her department are doing right now and the existing programs there. And the county has a slightly better perception, but again, we've got this city-county split that sort of is hard to get really good data out of that. We also asked folks about what is the favorability of different approaches to solving these problems, and we saw really strong alignment around the three strategies that we were proposing, which is direct investment of funding, donating land to affordable development, so public lands like underutilized sites or undeveloped sites, certainly not parklands or anything like that, but potentially developable public lands. And the highest approval rating of any of these was the idea of creating regulatory incentive packages to create more housing affordability. So I think that's an interesting thing to just keep in mind, that there's broad public support for doing something about these issues. So the other big piece of this project was to look at the regulatory context and look at, are there opportunities within the regulations, the land use codes, the subdivision codes, the townhome exemptions for the city and county to create these types of framework. The big takeaway from that is that you have some provisions for affordable housing in some of these codes, but they're pretty light. They're not well defined. And whatever incentives are being offered don't really have enough meaningful offsets to create real affordability, and they're also not they're not defining what affordability really is. So one of the important things that we always really want to see is a meaningful set of incentives that create, that actually offset cost for developers, but also come with performative standards that say, we need you to hit this price point, or we need to do this. I think there's also many that should just be best practices of efficiency that can benefit affordability across the level, but when you get to really big investments where communities are maybe saying, in this smaller development, we as a community are going to give up having a little bit of parkland, but we're going to get a couple affordable units out of it, or something along those lines, where you're actually making trade-offs and community investments to create affordable housing. The other big thing just with the policies is that the city's very progressive inward growth policies are something I'm very personally aligned with. I think they're the important principles of future growth and environmental sustainability that we need to look at. But to do such an ambitious thing, we need aggressive policies to offset the potential unintended consequences of that. Again, you know, if you don't create enough options for affordability within the community by adding different types of housing stock in different income levels and different configurations of detached and attached, you're going to end up with a situation where prices are going to rise. People who are existing homeowners are going to benefit greatly from increased pricing, but you're going to do things like force people out into the county, which is the entire opposite goal of what these policies would normally do. The other kind of context that you've got is that subdivision is really challenging in Montana because of the state laws. It's costly, it's time consuming, and there's almost no way around that. Townhome exemption development is one of the best opportunities to get around it. But there's also a ton of other ways that both the city and the county could look at incentivizing and streamlining land use review processes, proactive analysis around zoning and other issues that could help open up more land, create a nice balanced approach at working collaboratively with both nonprofit and for-profit developers to produce more affordable housing. So some of the key conclusions here, you've got really high land costs and low availability, and the situations that we're seeing from the development side, everything is getting more costly, and growth and development is booming all over the country right now. Major issues like the hurricanes in the Gulf, the fires in California are going to further put a lot of pressure on commodities, on subcontractors. And in many ways, up here in Montana, you're sort of at the end of the line of a lot of supply trains, and so you get impacted more than other folks. The supply of housing serving about half the working people in your community is gone. And this is what we really need to work on together, collaboratively, both public and private sector. Folks below the median income are pretty much getting priced out, and unless there's some pretty dramatic stuff done to work against it, that's just going to grow up in income level. We're talking, a lot of people think affordable housing like the very lowest income people. We're talking entry-level professionals here. We're talking a family of 3 earning $70,000 a year not being able to buy a house. And that's really, I don't think, the situation that Missoula wants for its community. It doesn't reflect the history of the community, and it's really important that we look at that. The quality of life is one of your challenges. This is a nice place, and you're always going to have to work to offset that. That's where the folks from outside with money are coming in and disrupting a little bit of this. But this is really a threshold moment to think about how do we make sure that you don't diverge into the resort community direction, and really make this a place where working folks can continue to live and enjoy a high quality of life, and the type of community you get from people who live in a place year-round. So I'm going to run through a lot of recommendations really quickly here, and they're in a lot more detail in the report, and we've worked really closely with the partners involved in this. But I want to hit the top level of all these because I think they're all really important. They show that we really thought about a range of things. And the way I want to kind of, frame this, you need a systems change approach to affordable housing, right? You need to try and disrupt a bunch of different things to get to a concerted, cross-sector collaboration around affordable housing. And that often involves everyone chipping in a little bit. Public sector, private sector, everyone giving a little bit so that you get a lot from the community, for benefit for the community. The things that we've put here are ideas that we've heard during the interview process, best practices from other communities, opportunities that we uncovered in our analysis. But it's important to remember that this is sort of just a laundry list that still needs to go through community process, because not all these are going to fit with the values of this community. And not all these solutions are going to work great here. But really the importance is that we look at trying a bunch of different stuff that impacts a bunch of different levels of the housing affordability sphere. So these report recommendations do need a community process around implementation that engages a really diverse group of stakeholders. This is bankers, realtors, nonprofit service providers, public agencies, really getting everyone around the table. And the city's already started some of this work, and I would encourage that to broaden to a wider sort of task force that looks at how do we create achievable benchmarks. There's nothing that breaks my heart more than a 150-page report that ends up sitting on bookshelves and not getting implemented. And it's really up to the people in this room, the partners at this table, to ensure that this stuff moves forward. And one of the biggest things that I have to highlight is that despite some differences and tensions around land use, the city and the county absolutely need to collaborate on their affordable housing responses. This is shared interest to everyone, and it's really an area where the city and county can come together and work collaboratively around an issue that's going to affect them both equally, and that solutions will require both of their participation. And typically we find the more alignment between city and county approaches to affordable housing, the more efficient they are, the less confusing they are for developers. It's just a really important aspect of overall functioning. So we broke these down into 5 sections that look at regulatory issues, program development, housing development, capacity building, and funding. And so I'm going to run through these different sections, 1 slide each, and just hit the high points of these. And then at the end, we can do a Q&A and talk about some of the questions that folks might have or the next level of detail. And again, these are described in the report in more detail for sure. But so one of the first ones is that under regulatory is that the city and the county should create a formal incentive program for affordable housing development. This looks at meaningful incentives that developers get for providing additional affordability in projects. One of the big issues around land availability is actually looking at even proactive rezoning to achieve densities high enough for development. Commissioner Curtis alluded to the high number of undeveloped sites in the county. An analysis that looks at why haven't those moved forward? Are those densities high enough to support affordable development? Things like that could really be critical. But especially in the city's taken great steps in creating areas on the future land use map that designate high density areas, but still putting developers through the risk of a community process and uncertainty and cost of going through a rezoning is proving enough to keep people from taking on potential infill developments that really need to happen. Another big one and an easy one that I understand is already starting to have a discussion on the city level is looking at liberalizing the development of accessory dwelling units. So these are your distributed infill rental housing, guest houses, granny flats, Fonzie flats, they call them in Australia. But the idea that these things are very low impact in existing neighborhoods, despite what a lot of people often think when there's one being built down the street. But it's literally one of the only ways that you have to create low-cost housing distributed throughout the city that in existing neighborhoods. And some communities are even looking at things like providing financing for these in exchange for hitting certain price points or other rental levels to serve lower income people. In Portland, Oregon, they actually developed these for free in your yard if you will let a transitional homeless person live in there for 5 years and then you own it outright. So there's really amazing strategies that could be looked at there. And the big thing is coordinating regulations between the city and county. Program development around affordable housing. There's no clear annexation strategy, and actually collaborative management of the urban fringe areas should really be looked at as a way of really harnessing the land use codes around the goal of affordable housing, things like infrastructure development, but also just little things like aligning city and county infrastructure standards, aligning city and county zoning standards, so if things do get annexed, they can achieve the densities they need to support affordable development. And that's all feeding into housing development. I think one of the big things that you do need to add to supply. You've got a huge population of potential buyers that don't have options right now. And so looking at how could you catalyze development that's meeting unmet needs in terms of price points or rental levels. And so big one, analyze public land assets for potential donation to catalyze some affordable development. Looking at targeted infrastructure development that really looks at areas that have the density and services to be able to grow in a way that can support affordable development, and maybe even look at infrastructure in exchange for certain levels of affordability as a leverage point. I think one of the other big ones that makes sense because of the tension with infill and potential for NIMBYs pushing back on new development is look at really high opportunity development sites and have public entities take over the community planning process around those, so you don't have the tension between a private developer and a neighborhood, so you have a more community-driven process that then can be turned over to a developer with a clear set of performative standards around affordability and other meeting other community goals that helps take some of the tension out of the development process. Trying to develop more affordable multifamily housing, so leveraging low-income housing tax credits, which are challenging, but new models of looking at 4% tax credits. Looking at maybe things like design standards for multifamily housing, because one of the big concerns we have is you see these big spurts of growth in multifamily, and it sometimes isn't the highest quality, and then the community has pushback against it and can constrain multifamily development down the road. So make sure the multifamily housing that you're getting is high quality. And then creating more predictable infrastructure standards for new development. I think one of the things we heard almost universally from developers is they go into developments not knowing how much the infrastructure in their projects are going to cost. And those numbers have to get predictable if folks are going to take on big projects when all the other pricing is going through the roof on this stuff. And then one of the other big things that seems like an opportunity, particularly in the city, is look at how incentives could be built into the townhome exemption development process. Townhome exemption under state law is sort of a free-for-all, and then the city created a set of regulations that make it more like a subdivision process, but I think there's probably a middle ground to look at that could incentivize more affordable development and create some great trade-offs for developers in exchange for lower cost housing and more housing on existing pieces of land. So on the capacity building side, what we recommend is convening a diverse coalition of folks to work on implementing this. And this is, in other communities, have been things like affordable housing roundtables that meet regularly to work on and assess the progress on implementing a strategic plan around housing. We really would love to see expansion of the capacity of local community development financial institutions. Those are folks, NeighborWorks Montana is one here in town, and those are folks who can put out new types of tools, consumer lending and other things, but also development financing. One of the great examples is a workforce down payment assistance program that was funded by a local hospital and managed by a CDFI that is a great model from another community that we talk about in the report. I think there's some new approaches to nonprofit-driven affordable home ownership development too that could be explored, where a mix of entry-level market rate and below market rate houses are developed together with basically subsidizing themselves within a project, and leveraging some of the resources that nonprofits can bring to the table. This is something that's been used in a lot of other communities, and we like it a lot as an approach because it doesn't need a lot of external funding to make it happen. It needs a catalyst to get started, usually a land donation or something else. But once it's up and running, it generates enough money to keep itself going. And can also be a great way of nonprofit and for-profit developers to collaborate on larger projects that neither one of them might be able to take on themselves. And then the other issue, I mean, construction capacity is a huge issue. Subcontractors, skilled labor. The economic downturn choked out a whole generation of potential laborers and future skilled workers. And we think there really needs to be a concerted effort on the community level to work with educational institutions, vocational institutions, high schools, to look at increasing the capacity in the skilled trades for construction in the community. On the program development side, one of the big ones and one of the first things that needs to be done is to create an assessment framework for measuring impacts on housing need. This is really the thing you go back to every year and that says, we're doing good, we're doing bad, we need to do better in this area, this strategy is working, this strategy isn't working. And that's kind of the framework from which everything else is built. As I alluded to earlier, investing in expanding your existing programs like homebuyer education and training, and making sure that there's increased down payment assistance resources for when homes start coming online. When you have, the worst thing to do is create a really successful affordable housing development program and not have the consumers ready on the other end to buy them. And that's particularly true when the private sector is making compromises to produce those homes. Yeah, the big one, and one of the ones that I think would be really helpful in almost every community, but especially here, is a community-wide housing education and advocacy effort. So really pulling together a diverse group of stakeholders to start advocating for these types of recommendations for new developments that are meeting affordable housing needs and new policies in front of elected bodies. So really thinking about just the fact that most working class folks don't have the time or the babysitters to participate in public meetings and aren't the ones that you hear about when they just quietly move away because they can't afford to live here. So who are the folks that can advocate for them? They're the big employers. They're groups that serve lower income people in other areas like healthcare or childcare. Pull together a diverse group of people to start educating the community and just create a baseline understanding of what the statistics are. One of the challenges we see a lot is that a lot of folks have owned their homes for a long time and don't know what it's like to try and rent or buy a house at this moment. So getting that information out in the community, helping people understand what the best practices are around this, and also creating some top cover politically for elected leaders to make difficult decisions that really do benefit affordable housing. And then expand approaches for preservation of existing housing. So making sure the best way to keep affordable housing is not to lose it, right? And building affordable housing is very expensive. So thinking about things like mobile home parks that are threatened, large multifamily complexes that need reinvestment or are losing their affordability restrictions, how do you keep those in the market? That's another really big component of the strategy. So the best for last and often the least popular, funding is really the key thing here. There's just not enough resources in play for creating affordable housing, and there's no better leverage in the private sector than incentivizing affordable development through investment in things like infrastructure, permit and fee waivers, and things that can actually help developers' bottom line and help them achieve more affordability. And so one of the big things we always recommend is that communities have a dedicated affordable housing trust fund, one that has a set of assets. Optimally, it's endowed with ongoing investments on an annual basis, but it can also be infused with a one-time funding, but really focusing on strategies that recapture and recycle that funding so that these assets grow over time. It becomes a pool of funding that supports affordability long-term in the community. The best approaches have some sort of dedicated annual funding source that people can plan multi-year how they're going to use the funding. But things like a bond issue as a triage approach, I think some great examples in other communities have done bond issues that provide gap financing on new projects, secure that with a second mortgage and recapture it down the road so that that money is constantly recycling, but could also fund things like down payment assistance or things like offsetting permit and fee waivers to help lower hard costs for developers. And then lastly, on the funding side, look at the existing funding sources that can be applied to development. So infrastructure investment, tax increment financing. How can those be aligned with affordable housing needs and structured in a way that they can incentivize meeting those needs? So as I said, it's not too late. This is really an issue that's on the cusp, and a concerted effort can make a really big impact in a relatively short period of time. You need to support some aggressive policy creation efforts, which are already underway at the city. Love to see that also happen at the county in a formal way, and collaboration between both those entities as they go forward. I think the city inviting a county representative into their policy creation process is one of the critical things that should happen sooner rather than later. And then the county looking at a similar process, particularly that focuses on the land use needs, those existing platted subdivisions that aren't moving forward, zoning and zoning alignment with the city as one of the key issues there. And then convene a wider group to oversee the ongoing implementation of this. This is really the critical piece. You need a big group of people invested in this and making sure that there's stakeholdership moving forward and that things are actually happening. And then really working to sooner rather than later convene the group to work on the housing advocacy and education in the community. I'd love to see, a really broad campaign that educates everyone about what the current situations are and what can be done about it. So with that, that's the 150-page report in 45 minutes. So I really appreciate everyone being here today and everyone that worked to support this and the 30-plus people that I talked to and really were very honest and frank with us throughout the whole process. And We've scheduled some time now to take questions. I don't know if you have an idea, Sam, of how we want to handle that. Just toss the microphone around.
Yeah, I think the room is, I think the room is small enough that we probably don't need to have a microphone out in the crowd, but if you have a question, just raise your hand, and we'll do the best that we can to answer it. We went a little bit longer than what we wanted to, so we won't have time to get to too many questions, but please feel free.
Yes.
Yeah, I was wondering if you lift the ban on being able to have accessory units in the city, like build an extra guest house over your garage. Is there any provision for regulating the VRBO market? Because if you lift all the bans on that, what stops everyone from having a VRBO in their backyard?
Sure, and I think you do have to look at things like short-term rental as part of the liberalization of ADUs. A lot of communities now are looking at things like owner occupancy requirements on site to keep it from being a huge issue. Looking at the statistics, it doesn't seem like the short-term rentals are taking up a huge batch of your rental housing stock right now, but it's only going to grow into the future. But other communities have looked at this, and I think it does have to be part of that policy, looking at how even incentivizing people to provide below-market rents and long-term rents through financing tools and other things is one of the great ways to do that, too. But it's a good question and an important consideration, yes. Who do we got? Oh, yeah.
Hi, thanks so much. So I appreciate what you said about this study establishing a baseline for us and a methodology that hopefully we can use in future years to continue to track our work. I was also really interested in what you said about preservation. So do we have data or a way to track loss of existing housing as new housing is being developed?
And at current, no. And I imagine land use departments, the question, okay, sorry, I should repeat that. The question was about preservation and if we currently have systems that measure the loss of existing affordable housing through redevelopment. And the answer to that is I bet the land use departments could look at some of that data. And it would be really interesting actually to look at doing an assessment around what is the existing affordable housing, especially more informal affordable housing like mobile homes, and what the potential threats are to those. A lot of times we see not just the issues with pressures for redevelopment, but a lack of sufficient infrastructure and other things where investment is needed to preserve that housing. So I think that's a really smart idea. Yes?
So one of your figures was about the median housing price being $268 for last year.
Yeah.
With so few properties being under the $200,000 and under the $250,000, what is your best guess for a median for this coming year with everything going on?
It's hard to say. I mean, the listing, okay, sorry. I'll learn how to do this eventually. The question was, what's the projection for median home price this coming year? I think it's definitely going to go up. It's hard to say. The trend has been a fairly considerable rate of increase year on year. Current listing data doesn't look great, but it's hard to know without an exact pipeline. One big development could throw off some numbers if they come in with really low-priced housing. But in general, I think it's going to go up again. And I think that's one of the things you just have to track. And maybe, being from the Realtors Association, you have a stronger sense of this. But in general, the numbers that we saw, listing data, things like that, are that you're going to continue to see an upward trend for a little bit, unfortunately. Yes?
I was surprised that no one mentions about property taxes. I get calls all the time in the city that the way they jump every year.
Yeah.
And that is putting the burden on a lot of things.
And actually, that is dealt with in our report where we talk about, particularly around affordable home ownership models, looking at tiered taxes for particularly if you're an affordable home buyer and you benefited from some program that discounted a house, that you pay taxes on the value of the house that you paid, not the total value. One of the strategies to kind of enhance affordability, but that would require, I believe, state level changes to tax code. But it's certainly something to keep in mind, and we include taxes in our calculations of affordability in this methodology, so we do look at that issue. But an important one for sure, especially for existing owners. Thank you for bringing that up. In the back?
As a small builder who, we do some small developments, we're constantly trying to be creative and innovate and try and come up with new ways to build better housing on the same sort of footprint that we have. I'm wondering that the housing industry is not what you would consider a young and disruptive industry. So what role is there for creativity and innovation, and is that important, and what should our regulators be doing to incentivize it?
That's a really good, did everyone hear that? Okay. The question was, he's a small builder who's really interested in creating more innovative housing development types and new approaches, and was asking about the roles that, the overall importance of that in affordable housing strategies, and two, how the local governments and regulatory bodies can support that. And I think that's it's very much one of the important pieces of this. We have a housing development model that's essentially been the same since post-World War II. And there is really a huge need for looking at new approaches, denser development patterns, and things like co-housing or other models that start to break down the traditional idea of how to approach housing development. Certainly, I think the regulatory bodies can be supportive of that. Other communities have looked at things like kind of experimental zoning designations that allow for things to happen that wouldn't normally be allowed in the land use code, that don't necessarily make you go through a planned unit development process, which is very costly and risky and not really worth it for a smaller development. And I think also thinking about how can you support all the legs of that, making sure that there's the financing tools that can back up doing that innovative stuff, because you may get the regulatory bodies to say, yeah, but then the banks aren't going to be there to lend you the money. Or if it's something that's really non-conventional, maybe not even mortgage financing on the back end. So thinking about how you could create a concerted program around that looked at all three of those pieces, right? Your capacity, the funding capacity, and then the regulatory room to do this stuff. But it's certainly hard, and it's something that needs to be done and should be supported. In the middle? Yeah.
I was just wondering about how other communities have partnered with each other to share best practices, and whether you've seen that in any other communities you've worked with.
It's one of the places where I think in the affordable housing industry we fall down a lot of times. There aren't big conferences for a lot of times for folks to go to and exchange information. A lot of the home ownership nonprofits do work together through national conferences and things like that. But certainly I think a lot of our work is sort of aggregating best practices from other communities and sort of sending them out into the world. But there could be a lot better modes of getting that information out. The challenge that we see, though, is just every community is so different. The affordable housing environment, the development capacity. And so really it is about sort of trying a bunch of different stuff and see what works, and constantly looking at that from a data perspective and saying, is this working? How do we need to iterate this to move it forward? Yes, sir.
Did you look at the interaction between Missoula County and Rio Valley County on our housing issue?
We didn't really look at detailed data in terms of outside of the county. We looked at some information about it, but not at the analysis level that could provide really detailed conclusions. Is there something specific that
Well, the definition of affordable housing in Missoula has long been Valley County. And
Right. And certainly, I think that plays a role both. I think there's stages of that, right? Like there's certain levels of affordability that you can find in rural parts of even Missoula County too, you know. But certainly I think one of the goals of this report is to focus on how do you create the housing here so people don't have to drive as much. So especially when you're talking about, you know, folks providing essential services in the community like firefighters and teachers and folks like that, that they're not having to drive long distances to get to the community, that they're really part of the community, and that you can lessen the carbon impact and the impact on infrastructure by making those options here. And that's really, again, our recommendations are to create a variety of housing types and at different pricing levels to try and address that. In the back.
Speaking of driving less, as we focus inwards and infill intensify, space is coming at a premium. Did you look at recommendations for decoupling parking requirements from multifamily housing developments? Structured parking can add $50,000 to the cost of a loan.
Okay, did everyone hear that, or can I repeat it? Okay. I can hear really good up here. I don't know what it is. Okay, so the question was about parking requirements and decoupling parking requirements. Parking is a big piece of what impacts housing affordability. It eats up a lot of land, it's expensive to build, and it doesn't generate any money. And the question was, can it be decoupled? So, you know, we looked, the city has pretty good provisions for allowing for reduced parking. Structured parking, as you suggest, is really expensive for developments, but when there's maybe centralized structured parking that can serve a variety of developments around a certain cluster of areas, I think I would consider things like structured parking and an infrastructure investment. But particularly in the county, there's some opportunities around reducing parking requirements. But one of the big things, and we were talking about this right before this presentation, is just we invest a lot in these modes of transportation that may not always be the predominant modes of transportation, and they're very costly to maintain, they're costly to build, and they have big affordability impacts. So parking is certainly something that we talk about in the report and is in the recommendations. One more question. Who's got the most burning question? Yes.
Our city and county, you pointed out our city and county used to work together. And we had a city county planning department for many, many years, and it was split recently in the last few years. How do you propose that they work together and get along?
Well, I think that the first way is looking, I offer different levels of different daring approaches to collaboration. The top level would be just on affordable housing policy, creating a coordinated approach around that. The next level would be to create a formal annexation policy that is developed collaboratively between the city and county. Where I live in Santa Fe, New Mexico, we have an extraterritorial zone that is a 2-mile buffer around the urban area that's collaboratively managed between the city and county, that has a separate board, which is maybe the most extreme recommendation, but probably the best one for smartly providing infrastructure and growth in the right areas and making sure that the interests of both the county and the city are being served and affordable housing is being supported at the highest level possible. So thanks, everybody. I'll stick around for a bit, so the folks who had questions that didn't get addressed, I'm happy to stick around and answer those, and check out the, thank you.